Okay, so just for the recording, I just want to say welcome to this online forum called From Authoritarianism to Radical Empowerment, Islam, Anarchism, and the Ummah. And so we're going to begin just by saying a little bit of background to Wisdom in Nature. So some of you are familiar with our work as the host organization. And for some of you, you may have kind of heard about us for the first time. So just a little bit of history that we actually started in around 2004 as the UK's first local Islamic eco-activist group. And so we were quite active with things like climate change, with campaigning. We'd have regular monthly forums in London and do activities, including the campaigning, nature outings, workshops, and give talks and so forth. And then we kind of evolved, having gained a lot of experience around holding space, around facilitation, and also moving into permaculture, trainings in Islamic ecology, permaculture, and facilitation or inclusive leadership, how to support a group of people to make collective decisions together in a way that draws the wisdom out of the group. And so we felt that's something that we can actually bring and offer trainings in and discovery type forums for those areas. And so we've evolved into being more around training and holding transformative spaces such as this one today. So that's just a very brief summary in a nutshell. I'm going to pass over to Shemessa, who's going to explain a bit about the 5-strand activism model.
Okay, yeah, so Wisdom in Nature's work is or stems from the 5-strand model, which is a holistic framework centered on co-creating conscious, just, regenerative communities that integrates land, people, and the economy. And so there are it's based around a movement away from things that are, or ways and systems that are destructive and degenerative towards more regenerative and life-affirming ways and systems. And so there's there's 5 strands. One is engaged surrender that underpins all of the other ones. And I'll just briefly go into the others. So one is earth and community. And that is around moving from corporate domination and consumerism toward simplicity and sharing and connection to the earth and its communities, including the other than human communities. There's a strand on deep democracy. This is about moving away from the concentration of power among the rich and privileged towards more equalization of power and honoring diversity and drawing out consensus and creativity. There's a strand on whole economics that is that's around the monetary system, moving away from one that's disconnected from real value towards systems that are just and nurturing to life and rooted in real value. And there is climate justice, and that is around moving away from dependence on fossil fuels towards renewable energy and just solutions. And yeah, as I said, the engaged surrender is a strand that to the divine is underpinning all of that. And so that was just a quick overview. You can find more in-depth sort of about all of this on our website.
Great, thank you, Shemessa. And just another thing actually about our work that we don't mention necessarily that often, but it sort of plays quite a crucial role is around funding. Is that actually we never apply for any grants, and that was kind of intentional because it makes us much more kind of accountable to people and much more able to adhere to the values that we believe in. It doesn't mean we're against it, doesn't mean we wouldn't do in the future, but we've managed to go all this time without ever applying for any grant money at all. So just to kind of name that, which goes in with the kind of values that we, the ability to kind of really root in those values. A little bit about just the framework of today and the format. There will be a kind of talk / I might ask Mohamed Abdou a few questions, and then there'll be maybe a chance for a bit of clarification questions. There will be breakout groups, so you'll get to kind of talk with each other as well in groups of maybe about 3. And then we'll come back into the main room as well and have some sharing around some of the themes that came out of your conversations. And there will be a kind of discussion. We might respond in the WiN team, Mohamed Abdou might respond, and we're all kind of part of that discussion, and we'll bring what we're able to articulate into something that is collective and beautiful, is inshallah. There will be a break at some time for about maybe 5 minutes. We'll see how we go. And the qualities that we invite at a time of polarization and so much kind of taking one view or another view, where we sort of stand is we encourage a space for difference of views, for nuances, and we invite the quality of listening and curiosity. So where there are different views, we really want to allow one another to be curious about where that's coming from, to hear, to listen, to understand and appreciate. So that's kind of the mindset and the kind of state of being that we encourage, that really we find enhances richness and the ability to collaborate in a deep way rather than in a mechanical way. So just to kind of name that. We're going to now start off with a little ritual, grounding ritual that I'm going to ask Valentina if she would lead that.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is kind of how we open and close our meetings, or when we meet, and we do it often with forums and different events as well. It's just, yeah, a nice grounding ritual. If I just invite you all to close your eyes and find a position you find comfortable, if that feels good for you. And then I would just recite Al-Fatiha, and then I'll take us out of it as well, and we'll do it at the end of our forum too. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. And slowly bringing back awareness into how we're sitting and feeling, and opening up eyes if they're closed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Valentina. And thank you, everyone, for co-participating in that. And before we go into the main part of it, just want to say the why we're doing this. That's really kind of helpful sometimes to really hear and consider why this is important to us in Wisdom in Nature and how this happened. Well, one of the things is that we, in one of our meetings, myself, Valentina, Shemessa, we felt we really want to be collaborating more, going into that edge, that permaculture edge of different ecosystems and that richness, in a social sense. And so that's an intention we have to do more more collaborations. And then at some point, Peace News, which many of you, I don't know if you've heard of, but it's a publication that focuses on creating a society for non-violence in the UK in particular. And they asked if I would write an article, a book review on Islam and Anarchism. And I saw the email and I thought, yeah, definitely. And that was Mohamed Abdou's book. And so I spent a bit of time reading and quite thoroughly the book, and then writing the review that is on Peace News. And there's a longer version on our website, which is before I edited it down to fit the word count for Peace News. So if you do want to read that, choose whether you want a shorter or a slightly longer version, or you're welcome to read both as well. And also we've been doing online forums on the theme around regenerative structures for a new society, that the current structures, they are not serving, they are degenerative and they're unsustainable. They're not going to last. So what are we left with, and we've done a number of themes, a number of topics within that theme within an online forum, including on the Zapatistas, including on the time in Medina of the Prophet's life, peace be upon him, and the community that was forming there and what that offers, and a couple of other focuses around the regenerative structures we need for a new society, which also fits in with our trainings, permaculture, Islamic ecology, and kind of how we hold space and make decisions and governance, that sort of thing. And something, anarchism is something that it sort of has a resonance, and we don't name ourselves as being anarchists as such in Wisdom in Nature as a collective group, but it doesn't mean that some qualities aren't shared, and it doesn't mean also that it could be useful to look through the lens of anarchism as something just to cut through and just see how things look like and whether anything from there is useful. There's also the context of, we've certainly felt within Muslim communities, of being not very conscious of how power is distributed and being quite top heavy, being quite centralized in power. And, just the question of how can we make decisions when people may have different views? Where are the tools and skills for that, or is it that one person decides because they're the leader? And it seems to be quite a centeredness on a kind of leader-centered sort of way of working, when there's a lot of beautiful stuff out there on other ways that draws the wisdom out. And so anarchism is just a useful lens to, and the different forms of anarchism, so I don't want to generalize either, to look through and to kind of sit with that and see how that affects us. Interestingly, also, anarchism is a term that that is commonly misunderstood, just as Islam is often misunderstood. And so let us not make the same mistake that others may be making towards us, and keep an open mind to really hearing what something is about. So that's a part of the background. Now, after the book review, I reached out to Mohamed Abdou, who did all the hard work because he wrote the book, and it was wonderful to get a very receptive, responsive reply, and we had good, fruitful communication and a couple of conversations before this event. And so I really want to thank Mohamed Abdou for his willingness, and also I know that other demands that have been put on Mohamed Abdou, but he's really held this slot and is committed to making this happen. He told us he wouldn't miss this for the world. I believe him. And so really appreciate that. And what we're hoping for this event looking forward is for this to be a kind of a catalyst, a stimulus for us to think more about how we connect, how we collaborate, what are the values, what are maybe the skills in the longer term that we can draw on, and the awareness and the mindset to collaborate better together, so we can have a clearer shared vision. and also understand where there are differences, but still be okay with those differences and be able to collaborate. So that's a kind of background to the why and the moving forward. And I'm going to just introduce Mohamed Abdou with the bio, so formal sort of introduction, and then I'll ask a little question to encourage us to lean into the topic. So Mohamed Abdou is a North African Egyptian Muslim anarchist activist scholar and the author of Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances. And there's the book here. Okay, and he is currently a visiting scholar at Cornell University and an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo. His 20 years of activist research and experience centers on Palestinian, indigenous, Black, and people of color liberation, and draws on the indigenous Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, as well as his participation in the Egyptian uprisings of 2011. So welcome, Assalamu alaikum, Mohamed Abdou. And I'm just going to start. I know you want to set a foundation, so very welcome to do that in your own way. Also, just before you do that, if you're able to maybe just summarize for yourself, from your perspective, what anarchism is, if you're explaining that to someone who's, say, 15-year-old who'd never heard of it. What is anarchism? If you can just briefly do that in a simple way and then go into a wider framing.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. First of all, I'm again very grateful and humbled and honored. It would be remiss if I don't again express my gratitude to Muzammal, Jumaisa, as well as Valentina, the Wisdom and Nature collective and group for their kind and generous invitation. And you're absolutely right, I wouldn't miss this for the world. Part of my attraction and draw, and it's particularly insofar as this event has to deal with the mission and goal of Wisdom and Nature, insofar as connecting to land and the importance of land and the importance and vitality of land-based struggles for lots of reasons that we could sit down and discuss: heavy urbanization, the metropolis, the civilizational narratives that are cast upon the urban versus the rural, and what land does insofar as structuring gender, race, sexuality, or sexual practices, let us put it that way, distributive economies, care, relationality, reciprocity, and so on and so forth, in relationship to non-human life and the notion of al-ghayb, or the unknown, what land has to teach us about the world, what creation has to teach us about the world, particularly in these polarizing schizophrenic times. Let me start off by saying, Musa's dua in when he was about to meet Pharaoh, Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. May Allah widen my breast and ويسر لي أمري, and to make my affairs easy, ويحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي, and undo the knot in my tongue, such that my speech becomes legible, accessible to you all. I'm very humbled and honored again to have you all be here. And so far as anarchism is concerned, and a basic premise of anarchism, if we're to define it, if you will, I don't believe in ideology, so I would never say that anarchism is an ideology. And if anarchists proclaim, as much as Islam or even Islamists, that Islam or anarchism is an ideology, then I find that to be highly problematic. Ideologies proclaim to be able to respond to all questions and mannerisms of life, with what that includes of ailments in the contemporary, let alone in relationship to a past, present, and a future. Anarchism means, or the proper Arabic translation of it is La Sultawiyya, as Hiba Raouf Izzat, a political scientist at the American University of, in Cairo University in Egypt, had defined. In an essay of hers, I believe, was titled Al-Fikra alladhi ظلمتها التاريخ, the idea that history had done injustice to. So anarchism, the correct translation is La Sultawiyya, without authority. It's often mistranslated in Arabic as, well, in English as chaos, as anarchy, and so on, in Arabic as fawdawiyya, which very much resonates with the idea of chaos, anarchy. Obviously, I find that term to be, or that particular definition, if you will, to be highly problematic. Anarchism, to me, is quite critical of power is quite critical of hierarchies. And in that sense, it differs very much. You know, when one reads the history of the First International, the Second International, the split that happened amongst, let's say, socialists generally, between Marxists and anarchists insofar as the question of the state, and particularly the question again of, is there a need for leadership? How do we eliminate ultimately this need for hierarchies if we're to achieve this utopian horizon that caters to all in an anti-oppressive way? Well, if your starting premise, as anarchists were saying to Marxists, is that we need to, if you will, take over the state, re-entrench particular vanguardist, hierarchical notions in the process of achieving that measure of liberty, then it is most likely that we are going to reproduce these hierarchical, asymmetrical power dynamics amongst the members of the general population, let alone that you will ultimately have a vanguardist class, the leaders of the revolution, that will ultimately be engaged in oppression, in the oppressions of their subjects. So we have Stalin, we have the Leninist purges, and so on and so forth. You will ultimately lead or be responsible for an authoritarian regime, as we've seen historically speaking, right? We see it in China, we see it in Russia, and so on and so forth. So anarchists tend to be, again, quite critical of this dimension of power. Power exists everywhere and nowhere. You all have power right now. You could choose to log off. You could choose to interrupt what it is that I'm saying. So as long as power is fluid, that is a beautiful thing because that allows power to be challenged. The problem becomes when we organize ourselves as movements that are out for revolutionary change, and what then revolutionary change implies, because there are two things or two pathways to it. You either seize the state and you see the state as an instrument of ostensible liberation, which is sort of the Marxist-Leninist approach, very, very broadly. And I would extend that ostensibly to Black Marxisms, to indigenous Marxisms as well, talking here about Walter Rodney, Sankara, and so on and so forth, and the legacy, Nkrumah, and so on and so forth, that these ancestors, these elders of ours, had led. Particularly during the post-colonial or anti-colonial era, versus more of a decolonial approach. A decolonial approach would say, we don't need to invest or reinvest in the state. The state is not reformatory, it's purgatory. And so we need to move beyond progressive politics. Bernie is not going to save us. He's obviously, ultimately, a soft imperialist who grew up in a kibbutz. He can't address Palestine, let alone gender issues, right? And so the alternative becomes a horizontalist mode of organizing. Intentional organizing, intentional communities based on land-based projects. So for anarchists, they don't see a separation between capitalism and the state. In fact, both are historically entwined. And though they may share short-term animosities, their long-term strategic interests are one and the same. This is what Trump referred to as the swamp. And he was absolutely right insofar as that neoliberalism, particularly with Thatcher, with Reagan, and later, obviously, with NAFTA, with Clinton, really opened up the door wide open insofar as the confluence and intertwining between the politics and economic realms in society and the inseparability of both, no matter how many checks and balances that one would like to produce. So in so many ways, racial capitalism is entwined with the state, which is also very much a racial project. We need to understand, and the problem with Muslims is they don't understand how to apply Islam to the contemporary because we don't understand the contemporary. And so we can't particularly offer solutions out of the false binaries that exist in the present moment, simply because, again, we're entangled within these false dualisms, right? Secularism, religion, and so on and so forth. So anarchists tend to be very critical, like I said, of hierarchies of the state, any form of authoritarianism or the possibility of the crystallization of power. Because once that power becomes crystallized in the form of institutions and hierarchies, it's very difficult to disrupt or even to challenge that power. So anarchists tend to organize on a horizontal level, and they are looking for revolutionary moments or opportunities, ostensibly to highlight continuously how we are in charge of our decision-making every single day of our lives. We decide whether to cross a traffic light, whether it's red or not. But we also self-regulate. We all govern one another very vis-a-vis the capillary relations that exist between us. So the state is not this abstract entity that is hovering over and above us. Because we've already internalized authoritarian dynamics, what is the function of the state? It's to act as this Oedipal father that teaches us to discipline, to control. to essentially, categorize children that are born, to dress them in blue or pink, male or female, all the binaries that begin to be structured, if you will, and that structure our lives from the moment of inception onwards. The state is a hierarchical, it's not only a hierarchical project, it's also a cis-heteropatriarchal project. That is one of its pillars. No matter how much it accommodates queer marriage or queer rights and so on, which we're very much seeing rescinded in the present, and ultimately laws won't change people's hearts and minds. It won't eliminate, and laws cannot eliminate queerphobia or anti-Blackness or anti-Indigenous politics. You can't legislate hate, and you can't legislate love for that matter. So it becomes about an element of transformative justice and not retributive justice, because retributive assumes, again, that you're working with the structure that is the state. And there are two types of state. There are post-colonial states that never really attained or achieved decolonization, because in a certain way, decolonization implies that one is going through their own discourses, their own cultures, their own spiritualities to develop their own forms of governance, their own forms of economics, and so on and so forth. It's as if we lost that political imagination. And if colonialism stole anything, it is the ability and the willingness of BIPOC people to dream dangerously. So, anarchism is in need of decolonization, because if we were talking about European anarchism, well, with Marxism, is trying to respond to liberalism, as much as it retains certain liberal dimensions, the primacy, for instance, of the individual, that is somewhat retained in individualist strands of anarchisms. There are many forms of anarchisms, of course, anarcho-feminisms, there's Black anarchisms, there's indigenous anarchisms, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and so on and so forth. Just to be noted, just as much as there are many formations of Islam. Anarchism also retains, in a certain sense, the anti-religious component, right? Most anarchists emerge out of Euro-American Christian households because they've only been exposed to dogmatic, authoritarian, white conceptualizations of Christianity. They tend to rebel about that and take up on a reactionary sort of impulse. No different ostensibly than Muslims who've been exposed strictly to a Salafi, Wahhabi, Muslim Brotherhood type of interpretation as well, that end up internalizing Islamophobia or resenting Islam or walking away from it. And I get that logic as well. So that is the fusing moment there, that I believe that Islam is inherently anarchistic, and that is precisely what the book is out to unravel from a Quranic-based perspective. And we can talk a little bit about the methodology that is employed, because I do adhere to classical elements of ijtihad, if you will, while at the same time evolving the concept, given the contemporary conditions, jahili conditions, if we will, but also evolved conditions that we live in the contemporary. So, I don't want to take up too much space. I'd like to allow room for, because I could sit down and talk about this for quite some time, for more of a trajectory vis-a-vis Muzammal and the questions ostensibly that he would pose, and I'd be able to respond to perhaps and illuminate some of the discursive interdisciplinary engagements that the book participates in, because it's participating in conversations that are going on in Afro-Indigenous studies, so between Indigenous studies, Black studies, queer studies, feminist studies, Muslim and non-Muslim, if you will, decolonization, post-colonial studies, psychoanalysis, and so on. But yeah, we need to understand what the role of the Oedipal father is, the state, what the role of capitalism is that commodifies, materializes everything. Nothing is sacred to it. Che Guevara on a t-shirt, right? There is a symbol of anti-capitalist resistance that capitalism is able to appropriate for its ulterior motives. Love is celebrated on Valentine's Day, or gay marriage and pride, surrounded by Heineken bottles and advertisements and so on and so forth. So how do we think through then, not just surviving, but thriving as people of color? How do we think, instead of thinking through the terms and concepts of resistance, to think through the concepts of liberation? So yeah, there's certainly a lot to talk about insofar as all that, but I'll return the mic back to Muzammal, if you will, and we can go from there.
Great, yeah, thank you. So I'm sure there's going to be questions around that. I just want to make sure we cover some of what was in the blurb that went round as well, and ask you to touch on what Islam offers. You know, what happened to Islam, or, you know, the kind of cultures within which Muslims operate, if there was an ideal or close to ideal, how does that relate to anarchism? What does it offer in and of itself? There are terms like, like Shura, like Ijma, consensus, and Tawheed, maybe to just come forward from a sort of Islamic perspective around how it relates to anarchism. And then I'd like to also ask another question, but you can lean into it, about the Ummah, but maybe initially Islam in the early days of it, at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and beyond, and its relationship with anarchism as a kind of central part of this next bit.
There are two historically significant dates. I mean, there are more than that, but two major historical significant dates, I would argue, that would respond to the question of what happened to Islam, what happened particularly to Muslims. I don't think anything happened to Islam. I think what happened to Muslims and their conceptualization and their interpretation of Islam. There are many Islams as there are visions of Islam vis-a-vis Muslims. So Islam is certainly not in fault here as much as Islam is not a monolith. And so because there are many interpretations of Islam, just to highlight a little bit about the methodology in responding as well, or en route to responding to that question. Of course, Islam is a heterogeneous traditions, and Islam interacts with cultures, and they play together. And as a consequence, we get Islams, or what I refer to as the names of different formations of Islam, if you will, beyond even the Sunni, the Shiite, the Ismaili, the Sufi, the Ahmadi, and so on and so forth, but an actually interactive relationship between cultures and Islam, or Islamic interpretations adequately. But they're not one and the same thing, because ultimately, despite the fact that we have many Islams, all Islams are tied with one book, and that is the Quran. So whether you're from the Nation of Islam, whether you're an Ahmadi or a Sufi or Ismaili, you ultimately are held by that barometer. And while I appreciate the Sunnah, the oral tradition, and I say the Sunnah in the broadest possible terms, because obviously Muslims will disagree amongst themselves as to what constitutes ilm al-ahadith and the Sunnah and so on and so forth, based on particular criteria that had developed during the classical era, if you will, onwards. That is also that requires revisioning, precisely because of the question of what happened to Islam or what happened to Muslims. The Medina Charter becomes very important, and the nascent period of Islam becomes very important, because when the Prophet ﷺ came with this message, as any other prophet, the idea was not to convey a set of dictums of do's and do nots. If the Prophet ﷺ and Anbiya and Rasul did that, nobody would inherently believe. If the matter was Muslim women, you need to wear the hijab, men, you need to act so on, nobody would be compelled to believe. The first 13 years of the Prophet ﷺ, as we know from the Seerah, came with one statement and one sole message, and that was Aqidat al-Tawheed. And Muslims were still drinking at the time, and were participating in many of the pre-Arabian Islamic or pre-Islamic rituals that existed at the time. And the idea of Tawheed was La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. Why was this so fundamentally important? Well, when you read accounts by historians like Muzammal Hussain or al-Asad, contemporary Muslim or non-Muslim, and so on, we see elements of and qualities of Jahiliyyah, femicide, for instance, the element of patriarchy that was rampant, and so on, and that arguably exists in all societies. But the element of femicide, the disparity between those that have and those that don't. But nonetheless, there was an element of asba'iyya, the responsibility that larger tribes had towards smaller tribes. So there was an element of social solidarity that also animated societies at the time. The Kaaba had 365 idols around it. One of those idols was Allah, Allat wal Manat, also as well gods that are mentioned in the Quran, and so on and so forth. And with Tawheed, it becomes very fundamental as a pillar, because it means that I pledge no allegiance to no authority but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means I pledge no authority to my tribe, to my nation, to my lineage, to my family name, to a leader, to a group, to an identity. Oh, because these folks are Black and I'm Black, because these folks are indigenous, and so on and so forth. That is not the qualifier whatsoever. It becomes out of strict adherence and loyalty to and recognition of the sole absolute authority and sovereignty lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no other, no nation, no state, no flag, no leader. In a world of nation states, obviously, that is part of the confusion, discombobulation, because what nation states ask us to do as part of their modern liberal Eurocentric Enlightenment ordering is they have replaced, if you will, God with the divine right of kings in a secularized, Christianized manner. So the other date that becomes important is 1492. 1492 is historically significant, and I still have a little bit more to say about, you know, the nascent period of the Prophet and perhaps what happened there. But 1492 becomes very significant because not only we see the conquistador Colombian, if you will, invasion of the Americas, the setting up of what is referred to as settler colonial order, because like I said, there are post-colonial societies and settler colonial societies. In the case of the US and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're founded on doctrines of manifest destiny, doctrines of discovery, that literally were religious doctrines, terra nullius, that argued that this land was empty, just as much as Zionists argue that Palestine was this desert, desolate place, uncultivated, and so on and so forth. So very much a part of that intertwining theme, white supremacist theme. That facilitated the clearing, the theft of the land, but also an ongoing genocide of indigenous people. So the genocide is not over. Indigenous people are still around and certainly still fighting and battling for the rematriation of indigenous land, on which a lot of diasporic Muslims are settlers. In other words, they are Zionists on stolen land, which is the ultimate hypocrisy that you're calling for the freeing of Palestine, where you are a Zionist on stolen land and you don't acknowledge your own complicity as you buy into Muslim American, Black American, and Native American, and so on, hyphenated identities. The irony behind that, the only person that doesn't have to identify in any hyphenated identity is the white American that is just considered to be the native, if you will. But 1492 is also very important because what was happening across the Atlantic, right? Muslims and Jews, Andalusia being evicted, murdered, persecuted, forcibly converted at the hands of the Ford vis-a-vis Ferdinand and Isabel, an ongoing crusading project. And because Enlightenment and European scholars understood quite well that with, if you will, the crusading societies that they had built, they could not confront or ward off or defeat Muslims and head-on collisions, if you will, the first, the second, even the third crusades, that the best way is, in a certain sense, to go around them. And hence the settler colonial project that they had set up, if you will. The idea was to racialize Islam, but also to, if you will, sectarianize it or to harp on the sectarian tendencies. So Europe emphasized an African Islam versus an Arab Islam versus South Asian Islam, pit these Islams against one another, and we don't really have to worry much. Iraq, Afghanistan in the contemporary, for instance, right? Sunni Shiite divides, and so on and so forth. But to also sectarianize it, if you will, as I know, the Shiite versus an Ismaili versus a Sufi, and so on and so forth, and an African versus a South Asian, and so on. So these were the jewel prongs. It is impossible to study race without religion for that reason. A fifth of the transatlantic Middle Passage slaves were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, Black Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula on the west coast of Africa. Again, the confluence of religion, spirituality is always there, and we can talk about religion as an anthropological term, category that developed at the turn of the century. The closest approximation of the term in Arabic is deen, but also Islam distinguishes between deen, ruhaniya, spirituality, and iman, faith. So yeah, while these categories are intertwined, they're not one and the same thing, and hence the difference between decentralized, anti-authoritarian religions and ones that are. In Judaism and Islam, we don't have a central church, we don't have the priest or the imam, if you will, is not a mediator between one and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need to think about this question of the imam and what exactly, who and what is the imam, which is a question that I get into, as well as the concept of Khulafa, because technically we're all Khulafa or caretakers of the land. We're all imams because ultimately that role of the imam varies. As we know from our prayers, we have to all consent that a person lead us in prayer, and just because a person led us in prayer one time does not mean that they'll lead us in the next, and the next, and the next, and so on. The imam is ultimately the Quran, because the imam actually comes from the verb which means to guide, and in the absence of the Prophet, the imam is the Quran. It is the ultimate barometer for us. But the prophetic times also resulted in something that was absolutely remarkable. When Muslims come to think of what they term as the golden era of Islam, they see it, unfortunately, in successive terms, insofar as, well, after the death of the Prophet, you had Abu Bakr, and then you had Uthman, and then you had you had Umar, and then you had Uthman, and then you had Ali. There are two problematics with that. When the Prophet instilled Islamic characteristics, and again, if we're to think about subjects becoming revolutionary, subjects embracing a new way of life, and this is the thing with revolutions, they don't lie outside us. They involve al-jihad al-akbar, or the greater jihad against our own micro-fascisms, because there is a mini Obama or mini Trump that exists inside each and every single one of us. New subjectivities have to be cultivated. What I mean by that is, for instance, if we take Umar, radiallahu anhu, Umar was a zealot man insofar as Islam. Why? Because Umar was a staunch enemy of the Prophet ﷺ. Umar was sitting in a gathering at one time, and the Sahaba asked Umar, radiallahu anhu, he was crying, weeping ecstatically, and then after that immediately started to laugh. So the Sahaba were baffled. Why is it that you're crying and all of a sudden you're ecstatic and laughter? And he said, well, I remembered that I buried my own daughter during Jahiliyyah period. And then I started laughing because I remembered that during that same period, I used to worship a god made of dates. And I ate those dates. Part of what I'm trying to illuminate here is Umar's character was different than Uthman, that was known as a Sakhi, very generous, is different than Ali, which is the door of knowledge, is different than Abu Bakr, who was considered to be kind, and soft and gentle-hearted. It is their characteristics, if you will, that mannerisms that complemented one another, as well, of course, as the women, the Sahaba, the women who were the wives of the Prophet, the muhaddithat, the narrators of the oral tradition, all that. And it is in complementing one another, both in person and putting into practice and embodying concepts, micro-anti-authoritarian concepts, I call them, Shura, which means mutual consultation, and putting that into practice. Because what is the point of Shura? If I'm engaging in Shura with you all, that means I have gotten to a point where I am perfectly okay with my fears, with my insecurities. I'm not embellishing my uber-machismo, my patriarchy that I've been weaned on, if you will, or my matriarchal practices. I'm letting go my guards in order to seek counsel and consult with you. I'm letting you into the intimate recesses, both in my private and my public affairs. And this is how we begin to conduct our decisions, if you will. Ijma, community consensus, is another micro-anti-authoritarian concept. Maslaha, what is of the best public welfare? If we are all living in a building together, or a small house, if you will, and I decide to paint my room pink, right? We could sit down and debate whether that's a personal choice or not, but if I decide to break down a load-bearing wall to expand an area of our living room, well, that becomes a problem because it threatens our entire house within itself. But then there's the concept of Khulafa, us being all Khulafa, if you will, caretakers of one another. And that's just from the political dimension of things. Now, when we begin to talk about economic principles and concepts, they cannot be separated from the political realm for the reasons that I noted, because they mutually inform one another, if you will. So in so many ways, because Muslims had, in a revolutionary way, embodied these principles in their day-to-day actions, and because power was decentralized, Umar being the Caliph did not mean that Umar was the ultimate decision maker and leader, because, as I noted, the practices were being embodied on a wide scale with that initial polity. And even during when one looks at the time of Medina, when the initial polity had moved there because they were being persecuted, and the relationships with the Medinians at the time, the element of solidarity, the Meccan Muslims who were disavowed and disembodied of everything, all their possessions. I mean, they had to flee Mecca because of the persecution. But how is it that they were received? What were their ethical, political commitments when they arrived in a territory that was not theirs? And here I'm evoking diasporas moving to settler colonial contexts, even if they're being persecuted, Palestinians, indigenous people from Latin America, and so on and so forth. There becomes an element of positionality, of acknowledgement. But with all that said, there is also a limitation of strategic politics insofar as identity politics themselves. As I note, and to speak now to the element of the Ummah, if you will. So Muslims forgot all that turath, the element of embodiment, and they began to think, oh, well, you have a thing such as the Islamic State. Even the ISIS repeats this notion that there is such a thing as an Islamic State, that the state is a modern concept. And dawla does not mean state. We did not have a word for state in Arabic. So as the book describes, we took a word in the Quran, dawla, used in two different verses, and transformed of its meanings, because dawla means to rotate. It comes from the verb zal, to go away, and dar, to rotate. So it is a poverty of imagination. It is a poverty of letting go of traditional forms, or if you will, our own forms of governance vis-a-vis the ummah, because besides sovereignty lying with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sovereignty also lies with the ummah. Allah did not define macro-political governance ways or structures. He left that open in a certain sense to Muslims, but also defined it vis-a-vis this thing called the ummah, right? Which was, again, if one is applying Khulafa in the plural form, Shura in the plural form, Ijma, and so on, one can never achieve a social mode of organization, of governance, of discipline, of control as the nation state. And of course, this was generally the model that existed within pre-modern times. Decentralized dawlas, if you will, that collectively sometimes were at odds with one another. Sometimes there were dawlas within the dawla, all that fermented an ummah, and an ummah that included Muslims and non-Muslims. I situate the ummah within the Medina Charter that includes non-Muslims, but part of what I do vis-a-vis the Quran is also look at the term mu'mineen, because God does not shy away from being very explicit insofar as lughat al-khitab, or the language by which they speak when they are speaking in the Quran. What I mean by that, in many verses we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, Ya ayyuha al-muslimeen wal-muslimat, O Muslims, across genders. But in so many other verses, God is saying, Ya ayyuha al-mu'mineen wal-mu'minat, O believers. This is not confined to Muslims. It's confined to anybody with a sense of belief. So I began to trace what are the ontological, epistemological, ethical, political commitments that define the mu'min, the believer, and the Muslim. And one arrives that the mu'min, the Muslim, even if they don't call themselves a Muslim, if you will, is the one that tends to the earth, that doesn't corrupt, that doesn't engage in its facade, that doesn't engage in its waste of its resources, surplus value, capitalism, and so on and so forth. So is one that honors the land, is one that honors neighborly relations, is one that honors the children, the elderly, women within the community, that minds the rights of the poor, and so on and so forth. So a very much an anti-oppressive social justice framework. That the trunk of the tree has been left and been abandoned for wider minuscule debates within Muslims as to whether queer Muslims are legitimate Muslims, whether they are haram halal, whether Muslim women should be wearing the hijab or not, and so on and so forth. So we've drifted off to the branches of the tree and have left the foundation, which is the trunk. So to me, the Ummah includes Muslims and non-Muslims, and just because somebody calls themselves a Muslim does not mean that they are part of the Ummah. Because to me, well, you have Wahhabis that call themselves, you have misogynist Muslims, you have anti-Black Muslims, and so on and so forth. That, as far as I'm concerned, because of the ethical, political commitments that should have arrived with the name of Islam, but they have forsaken those commitments, well, how can they be considered Muslims? And similarly, we have non-Muslims that in so many ways abide by the ethical, political commitments that Islam had come about with. So, and here I'd like to distinguish between morality and ethics. Thou shalt not kill is a moral commandment, but I don't believe in nonviolence. I believe that's a liberal sort of framing of things. You know, if you will, we're exposed to all kinds of violence every single day. There's violence to produce the law, to conserve the law within the form of the state, sexism, racism, etc., biophobia, classism are all forms of violence, horizontal forms of violence, not just structural and symbolic that we're exposed to, that we reproduce amongst one another every single day. So to me, that is what formalizes the Ummah. When you tell me, oh, well, I'm Jewish, that tells me nothing about you. Are you Zionist? Are you somebody who believes in ping-ponging? Right? And that tells me more about your ethical, political commitments than you telling me that you're a Jew, or you're a Muslim, or you're an anarchist, and so on. And so hence is the strategic limitation of identity politics. What is Blackness when we have Afro-Indigenous people that are dispossessed from their Blackness and from their Indigenous belonging? So in so many ways, the book works through this. It also works through what is necessary in terms of solutions, social movement solutions for a resurgent Ummah. How do we all embrace our indigeneity in a non-racial, non-ethnic way, insofar as the place and the sense of belonging that we derive from being in a place? For instance, for me, being a settler on stolen land, I have a responsibility to the stewards of that land, to not only announce oneself, but also to build relations to them, to pledge, if you will, my sovereignty to what we are building together, our sovereignty to what we are building together in the name of creator, in the name of creation, as opposed to pledging my allegiance to US state that I will supposedly defend and protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. You swear that allegiance. How can that not contradict? So we engage in all kinds of jahili practices, kufr practices every single day, not only in terms of our participation in citizenship politics, when we should be striving to become non-citizens as opposed to good or bad citizen logics, as Mahmoud Mamdani had defined it, good Muslim subjects, obedient subjects, etc. I'm not interested in being disciplined. And part of discipline is a form of empire making, unfortunately. So it is about becoming undisciplined from an interdisciplinary sense, to locate all our struggles intertwined, and all our fires are connected that way. And it is for the future generations, as Mohamed Abdou said. Our children are what come from infinity, and they are the arrows that we shoot towards immortality. So what exactly are we leaving behind for them? We need to look back to the 60s and 70s and really be able, because part of the conflation that I see within social movements, so this is not just a theoretical analysis, is the faltering of what happened in the 60s and 70s. In so many ways, we see the Pan-African, Pan-Arab, socialist, if you will, impulse that existed, but they were trying to use the master's house to dismantle, the master's schools to dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde had taught. They were Nasser, again, Nehru, all these revolutionary subjectivities were trying to use the state. Sure, they were trying to break out of the boundary of, well, Egypt tried to unite with Syria. That didn't last long because of the geography. Egypt wanted to unite with Libya and Sudan and so on, to break those boundaries. But again, they were trying to do it through the nation state. We have, though, the example of the Zapatistas. We had the Red Power movement and we had the Black Panthers. Their approach was very different. They weren't demanding anything of the state. The Panthers went and established their own breakfast programs, took over their neighborhoods, and they were prepared to arm themselves and defend themselves. A very different logic. Then again, getting into the direct confrontation, and this was the problem of Tahrir. We did not have alternatives on the ground. No educational alternatives, no health alternatives, because a revolution is not, again, about transforming something outside you. It starts from within. And then manifesting that. So the spirit of Tahrir did not transform to the factories, to the collectives in terms of the neighborhood councils that we established, to the gender relations that were broken down, or gender boundaries that were broken down. For instance, women were manning checkpoints in Tahrir. All that has been reversed. There was no police, there was no army up until Egyptians asked for the army to intervene, and so on. And we can all tell and surmise what has happened in the case of that beautiful moment of Tahrir, in which people exercised 18 days of genuine liberation. We took over the decision-making insofar as our own lives. We'd bring food down to Tahrir Square from our households. We scrubbed, got on our hands and knees and scrubbed Tahrir. That spirit has been long gone because we want to throw that responsibility. And here's a key point. States operate vis-a-vis a politics of rights, the lowest common denomination between struggles that is necessary for a party or political representative to be elected. Islam operates vis-a-vis siyasat al-mas'uliyat, a politics of responsibility. You don't have rights until you fulfill your responsibility from an ethical political paradigm towards others. What happens when we have disagreements? Well, Islam lays down, and this is the benefit of Islam and the spiritual dimension that we bring, insofar as usul al-ikhtilaf. It developed an ethics of disagreement. It tried to understand the psychology by which and why people disagree with one another. And there are many reasons: dogmatism, egoism, ignorance, stereotypes that we've internalized with regards to one another, and so on. So, and I discuss the reasonings and how, again, we can begin to mitigate differences when we do have differences of opinion. And sometimes the differences of opinion will be over small issues, and sometimes they'll be over strategic issues, which are far more relevant and important. But Islam also offers usul al-diyafa, or the politics of hospitality. You know, assuming that we're going to have disagreements is predicated on the fact that in so many ways that we don't know one another. And that's part of the reasons disagreements happen. We don't invest in one another as communities, as people. We want to know each other's names. What do we do? What are our general elements of belief? But solidarity, which is a verb, involves much more than that. How many anarchists invested, for example, in getting to know Muslim communities, broke bread with Muslims during the anti-war protests, despite the fact that there are many leftists that were active? How many Muslims reciprocally went and have been active within lefty, if you will, communities. So part of the problem is the secular animus that is informed by a Euro-American Christian ethos that informs our movements, our lives, that I very much reject. And the need then for that spiritual dimension. Of course, anarchists orientalize indigenous spirituality. And unfortunately, indigenous people play to that romanticization and to that tokenization just as much as a lot of people out of a sense of guilt, hurt, pain, participation in anti-Blackness also tokenize Black people and Black struggles. But investment needs to go deeper than that, because living on a piece of land together exposes, if you will, the pet peeves that we may have one another, but it also exposes major, perhaps, ways of doing things that we may disagree on. And how do we do that? How do we practice solidarity if we're not on the land together? If we're not living together? If we're not investing in all these relationships together? That becomes the idea. If I'm investing in indigenous struggles and getting to know people, I have to accept the fact that I'm going to mess up, be called out. I have to accept the fact that I need to listen. I need to engage in self-education. I need to know what territory I'm on, what treaties guide this particular territory, this particular dispossession. But once I'm building with them on the land, I have divested, and here's the key point, I have divested from ever having to buy my food at Wegmans or at shopping marts or whatever it is, wherever it is that I buy my food, because I've divested from that. I no longer have to actively fight capitalism that is far more powerful than me, given its access to paramilitary groups, let alone the army, police forces, and so on and so forth, right? So what I'm arguing for is a divestment. And of course, that is a dangerous thing to do, because when you build yourself a movement like Zapatistas, you become even more threatening. And that's what made the Panthers more threatening, actually, than the Black Lives Matter movements that had happened, right? So Black Panthers took things far more further than Black Lives Matter ever did because of their construction of alternatives that way. So that becomes the idea. If I remove and I divest, what am I voting in? I'm voting in a settler colonial state. Well, voting is not a form of harm reduction because it emboldens the structure that dispossessed the original caretakers of the land in the first place. So why am I voting? The idea, again, is to divest, to build these alternative communities, and hence to render the state, politicians, as well as capitalism irrelevant or obsolete, as opposed to entering a direct confrontation when we are not prepared for it in the first place, and when there is no international or general strategy that we can, if you will, operate from in confronting these hegemonic orders. We haven't done the work, quote unquote, on the left. And I hate the terms right and left, because politics operates around if you will, a circle. Fascism is a mass psychology precisely for that reason. It's not something that the right practices that we only see amongst Trump masses. I actually prefer that kind of fascism because I can deal with it head on. Liberals practice fascisms. Leftists practice fascisms. They're fascisms insofar as Islamophobia. They're fascism insofar as liberal multiculturalism. They're fascism insofar as, well, my parents, my generations, or I didn't have a hand in dispossessing Black people or indigenous people or in anti-Blackness or slavery. So why do I have to deal with any of this as a diaspora? That's fascism. So expanding our understanding of fascism, which unfortunately, again, if one needs to distinguish between totalitarianism and fascism. You know, what Trump was trying to do was totalitarian. He's trying to become Kim Jong-un, he's trying to become Xi, he's trying to establish that totalitarian order, right? Fascism, it's already imbued in the structure of the nation state and capitalism because of what it has produced of masses that are authoritarian, that are materialist, that are individualist, that engage in an oppression Olympics. And we see that embodied in our movements. You're more oppressed than me, I'm more oppressed than you. Oh, look at in Tunis, the anti-Blackness that is happening in Tunis, against even Black Tunisians. Do we not think that this is going to spawn anti-Arab sentiment and Black Orientalist views with regards to Arabs and with regards to South Asians? Of course. All we learn from oppression is learning how to repeat it unless we dismantle it, right? Unless we actively engage in decolonization. That requires a narrative, though. We need a narrative that connects, and that was the whole idea of the book. It was trying to, at its most delirious state, continue with Malcolm's project. Where would Malcolm be now if he wasn't assassinated? How would he have incorporated more cogently, more poignantly, indigenous struggles? What would have been his view on Salafism and Wahhabism, given what we've seen as a product? What would have been his view with regards to the Muslim Brotherhood? He visited Egypt, he'd visited Saudi, Mecca and Medina, and so on. So it is a continuation of that. When indigenous water protectors are being labeled as jihadi terrorists by paramilitary groups in the US, such during the No Dakota pipeline protests, that should signal very easily to us as to, again, the connections of the significance of 1492. Black Lives Matter protests are referred to as Black extremist groups. Everything is cast in the quintessential image of Islam because of what that historical signifier manifests of anti-oppression, of social justice, and because, historically speaking, the majority of people of color, the majority of Muslims had always been people of color, if you will. So, you know, again, I address Arab supremacy, Sunni supremacy, even Shiite supremacy. All these are themes in trying to, again, redevise, re-envision, redream a resurgent Ummah. So I'll stop there. I don't wish to digress a little bit more, and I'll pass it back on to you, Yunus.
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to also give a chance for others to contribute. So I think now might be a good time to, while we'll have a discussion all together and a chance to put forward questions as well. We'll move in a moment into breakout groups, but before we do that, we'll take a short break of about 5 or 6 minutes. And then we'll get into groups of about 3. When we come back from the break, we'll run through just a few instructions just to frame what you might want to think about or how you might want to engage, just so we can have an inclusive conversation and have that happening within the breakout groups. So on my clock, it's 26. So if we say to come back at 32, and not a round number. So if you come back at 32, and then we'll start to form the breakout groups. So, yep. So if you want to get up, stretch, cup of tea, whatever you need to refresh, please go ahead, and I'll see you in a few minutes.